I'm Patrick Byers, Horticulture Field Specialist with University of Missouri Extension. Thank you for joining us for our series of videos, Practical Advice from Successful Farmers. Today the topic is alliums, onions, leeks, and garlic, and we'll be hearing from and learning from Curtis Millsap of Millsap Farms near Springfield, Missouri.
I'm Curtis Millsap at Millsap Farm here in Springfield, Missouri. And today we're going to talk about alliums. Specifically, we're going to talk about bulb onions, garlic, and leeks. And we're going to start by talking a little bit about how we prep the soil. So taking a step back, it's important to remember that all three of these alliums are, the part we eat, are enlarged leaf structures. And so when I think of, as a farmer, how I'm going to grow leaves, I think that they're going to want a lot of nitrogen. And that's a pretty good assumption with your alliums. So we're going to make sure that we give them lots of nitrogen, as much as they'll use. And there's several ways we do that on our farm. So first off, of course, the standard idea, we want some fairly well-drained soil because these crops, they're not particularly tolerant of waterlogging like any more than any other crop particularly, especially as they approach maturity. So I like putting raised beds out. And so we usually end up raising our beds a few inches, and we use a wide bed method. So typically they're 36-inch wide beds, raised up a few inches from the surrounding soil, and then we'll have a depressed path between that and the next bed. And we operate 100-foot beds, so 100 foot by 3 foot wide. On that space, we're going to apply, it depends on the material we're using, but if we're using, like, for example, a composted chicken litter fertilizer, which would look a lot like kitty litter, something like Dairy Dew, or used to use one called Chick Magic. Depending on where you are, there's different ones available. But we would tend to use around 15 to 20 pounds of something like that on a bed. And this is going to be quite a bit higher than the recommendations that you'll find on the residential garden type of application. But that again is because we are growing a particular crop here, and that is a crop that really wants nitrogen and is going to feed heavily on that nitrogen. So we want to make sure we give it as much as it'll take. And then we'll do that pre-plant, and then with all three crops, if we remember and the timing is right, then we'll also do a little side dress about a month before physiological maturity. So anyway, that's an important part of prep. Also, of course, they love compost. All three of these crops will pay you handsomely for using compost on them. We don't tend to use fresh compost in front of these crops. We tend to have applied the compost the season before. And that's partly because of our rotation, but also because having any sort of chunks or things like that in your soil in front of onions can make the transplanting process a bit of a pain. So I'd rather use beds that have already been composted the year before. So in our case, that typically means like bulb onions follow the sweet potatoes, which go in a heavy compost application, or the leeks are a little more flexible, but we'll usually put them into somewhere where we're also growing some summer crops. And then on the garlic, that tends to go into the same beds as our overwintered onions, which would be, again, those sweet potato beds that have had a heavy compost application that spring, and then it's mellowed all summer, and so now we're ready to grow some alliums. The third consideration in prep is just to remember that they need lots of water. For years, one of the mistakes we would make each spring with our garlic was not giving it enough water. It's really tempting to think, oh, it just rained last week, and so that garlic doesn't need water. But garlic and all the alliums, for the amount of work they're doing, they have a relatively weak root system, or relatively shallow, we'll say. And so they can dry out fairly quickly. They're tolerant of that, but that doesn't mean you're going to get your best results. So you want to make sure that you have a water supply that is adequate and easy to use, that you can give them a real regular watering. They will reward you for it. So raised beds, nitrogen fertilizer, compost, and then making sure we have an adequate and abundant water supply that's easy for us to access. We do use overhead water for most of our watering of alliums, and most years that doesn't seem to cause any problems. There have been a couple years when it got wet enough that we had some botrytis and purple blotch in our onions, particularly in our bulb onions, and a little bit in garlic at times. And the problem with that is, the reason that comes up is mostly because of wet foliage. The leeks don't seem to be as bothered by that, so it's a little less of an issue there. So if that's a particular problem in your area, or if you're in a low-lying area, we're on a hilltop here, so we dry out pretty regularly. But if you were in a shady or cooler place maybe, then you might want to consider using drip instead of overhead. And then one last thing I'll mention in terms of prep is mulch. And on the mulch, I would say we've not had a lot of good results mulching our bulb onions, although some people do. We don't do that. We have mulched our garlic and our leeks both and seen both of those respond positively to mulch. The big hassle with mulch for us is that once you've mulched and then the weeds come up into the mulch, it can be a real hassle to remove. So sometimes, more often, we do not use mulch. We just use a lot of compost, and that kind of supplies that surface mulch functionality without the difficulty of an actual straw or hay or leaf mulch kind of a situation. So anyway, that's the important details about prepping for our alliums. So now we'll talk about the specific varieties. All right, so we're going to talk about bulb onions and the choices we make right off the bat as we start to plan which bulb onions we're going to grow. So with bulb onions, essentially your path immediately diverges in two directions. One is overwintered bulb onions and the other is spring planted. So we do both on Millsap Farm. Overwintered onions would be planted in September, October, even as late as November, depending on the varieties you're using. You can get away with that. And then they overwinter in the soil. They're establishing roots. Some winters, like this one, they get a mild fall and they put on a lot of top growth. Other winters, it starts out cold and stays that way, and they stay pretty dormant, but they're putting on root growth the whole time. And then about mid-February or so, those onions will really start taking off and shooting up tops and growing aggressively. And as soon as that happens, they are establishing all the leaf growth that is eventually going to translate into bulb growth. And so the thing to remember about onions as a whole is that the more top you have when the time clock ticks over and the onion plant goes, now it's time to make a bulb, the more top growth you have, that will translate into more bulb. And so the race with onions is always, can we get them a whole lot of top growth before the clock kicks over into it's time to make bulbs. So that's the advantage to overwintered onions, is you kind of get the maximum possible amount of time there. Partly because they are actually sitting in the field over winter, but also because as soon as the weather's nice, as soon as it's onion growing weather, those onions are out there established, ready to grow. So they've kind of prepped and ready to take up that solar energy and nutrients and water and turn it into an onion plant. The disadvantage to overwintered onions is that you have to protect them over the winter. And so this winter, for example, this is 2023, 2024, we had a very mild fall in 2023, but when the cold finally arrived, it was extreme cold in early January of 2024, and so in -12, -13 out here, and unfortunately one of our row covers blew off at some point in there, and so we lost most of those overwintered onions, the ones that the cover blew off of. So we lost about a third of our overwintered onions this winter, simply for an equipment malfunction or a lapse of attention. And so that's an expensive mistake. So the other side of onions, the spring planted onions, have different risks, but is one risk you sidestep with doing spring onions is the overwintered hazards. Spring planted onions, again, we have two options there, as we did in the fall, and that is plants or sets. And so plants would be a little pencil sized, usually pencil thickness, green. They look like tiny green onions. And of course, most of us have planted these. If we've ever bought onion plants at a hardware store or something like that, that's an onion plant. And of course, you can start them from seed as well. And if you want to start your own from seed, then you tend to do that in December, January. In a greenhouse setting, you've got to keep them moderately warm. They're tolerant of cold, but they appreciate the warmth, and they'll grow faster because of warmth. And with the idea of ending up with about somewhere between a ballpoint pen and a pencil thickness on your onion plant at that time period where you're ready to plant, which is usually the middle of March. We aim here in Springfield, Missouri, to plant on the 15th of March, give or take a few weeks. And the other way to do this in the spring would be sets. And sets are these tiny little bulb onions. And so they look like exactly like this onion here, but they are the size of maybe a shooter marble or even a regular sized marble. So they're pretty small, and sets do a great job of taking off and growing very quickly. The problem with sets is that most set varieties don't store very well. And so you don't tend to end up with an onion that'll hold, and even sometimes it doesn't even make quite as much of a bulb as you will get from an onion plant. So variety-wise, you're kind of making these decisions. Am I going to use sets or plants? And then, of course, there's a whole variety of choices you make within the plant category. Do I want something that's supposed to be a long storage onion? Do I want something that's a big sweet onion? Do I want a red onion, a white onion, a yellow onion? So you got a lot of choices to make there. On our farm, we tend to grow a lot of candy onions, and then our overwintered onions are primarily Forum. And Forum is unique in that it is an overwintering onion set, and we're really fond of that. It gives us a lot of flexibility in when we can plant it. Overwintering onions from plants is certainly possible, and lots of growers do it, but the timing is very specific, and so we appreciate the flexibility that the sets give us. So whichever direction you go with your onions, whether you're overwintering or spring planting, there's a couple things you want to think about because it's going to make life easier and better for these onions. Well, the first one is, as we go out to plant them, let's be very particular. I love to put mine in straight rows, parallel rows with even spacing between. On our farm, that typically means 6 inches between rows and 4 inches in row spacing. Now, that's not going to give us the biggest possible onions, but it's going to give us an onion that fits our market demand. And the reason that I'm really very particular about the 6 inches, parallel rows, straight rows, and 4 inches between is because that makes our cultivation much, much simpler. If we have a hoe that is 3 inches wide, then that makes it easy to pull it across there and hoe in between our plants. And if we have a 5-inch hoe, we can roll down through there on the 6-inch between row spacing, and we can wheel hoe or hand hoe very quickly. So spacing is important. So we want to lay them out just as we can. And the reason all that really matters is because onions never establish enough of a root mass or a top to compete actively with weeds. Any weeds will directly impact the yields of your onions. So it's really important to keep them weed-free and to do that early, middle, and late. Now, there's never really a time when it's okay to let your onions get a little weedy. You will pay a price for that. So we got them established on a nice grid pattern. We've got them on a 30-inch bed, so that means I usually have about 4 to 5 rows of onions on top of that 30-inch bed. And I'm going to keep those onions, like we said, well watered. Now, of course, oftentimes in the spring, that's not much of an issue. We get enough moisture that it kind of keeps things chugging along quite nicely. We will always water immediately after establishment. Even if there's rain in the forecast, I pretty much always set out some sprinklers and water those plants in. They will thank you for it. Every transplant always wants to be watered immediately if you want the best results. So, and then after that, we would be looking for that kind of typical 1 to 1.5 inches a week of rain on those beds. More early as they need that extra moisture to settle the roots in and really get established. And then that could probably back off a little bit later in the spring. Do remember we're always watching for purple blotch and botrytis, which are 2 funguses that are going to try and take over onion plantings. Most springs, we don't have much trouble with either one of those. Up on our hilltop here, we have a lot of wind, so things tend to dry out. But we, on a couple different occasions over 17 years, have had major purple blotch on our onions, and it always comes up in a really wet, humid spring. And so there's not a lot you can do to fight that. You can spray copper, you can spray things like Actinovate or Root Shield. They're supposed to be helpful. But the best thing you can do is, as much as possible, plant them in some place where they're going to drain out and they're going to get a reasonable amount of breeze. And so that's part of why our favorite onion field is the open, windy one. The onions don't mind a little wind, but they definitely mind being wet all the time. So there you are. You've got your onions planted on a grid. You got them well watered. You got them prepped with fertilizer. You're keeping them weed free. And then when we remember, and this is not every year, unfortunately, but typically, if we can remember, around the 1st of April or so. And so this is when for us, this means the plants are probably about 1 foot tall. They're really starting to kick it into high gear in terms of growth. We're going to go through and side dress. And this side dress will be a lot less fertilizer than what we did in our pre-plant. So we might be looking at like 5 to 7 pounds of that chicken litter fertilizer or something like that per bed. But still a fair amount of nutrition, and it will make a difference. It'll help them size up. Now there's a window of opportunity here. If you go too late, it's not going to help anything. In fact, it might even hurt something if you give them too much nitrogen late. It might cause them to be a little bit too watery and store less well and be more vulnerable to fungus at the end of their life. But that's a nice thing you can do, and it's a good idea to do, is to side dress them as they wake up in that spring and really start growing. And then finally, of course, we're going to look for that window of harvest opportunity. And so different varieties and different systems will mature at different rates. And so the earliest onions that mature on our farm are usually those overwintered Forum onions. And the way we know they are ready is because what has been a very upright plant, with leaves have been very vertical and turgid, start to soften at the base, and those leaves will start to fall over. So that's one of the things we're watching for. And usually they won't fall over individually, they'll fall over, the whole neck will fall over. So if you don't know what's coming, it's kind of distressing because you go out one day and half of your onion plants are keeled over out there. Don't worry, they're supposed to be doing that. And our threshold for harvest is usually around 50%. When about 50% of the necks have fallen over, then we'll just start harvesting. There are farmers who go through and break the necks over before harvest, a couple days before harvest. We haven't ever done that. I don't completely understand the rationale for that. It doesn't seem to be necessary to get a good harvest. And then another thing to watch for, I should mention, is you're going to watch a weather window, right? So we don't want to harvest our onions in the midst of a real wet spell, if we can avoid it at all. And so if we see something coming and we say, well, look, a few of the onion tops are starting to keel over, and then we got a week of rain coming, then we may go ahead and jump the gun and get those onions harvested a little early, or vice versa. We may wait out a wet spell and wait for it to dry up a bit. Our favorite alternative would be that we have a nice, sunny, breezy, warm weather window. And for us, that's typically, we're looking at the starting harvest of the actual storage onions for bulbs. That would be the end of May, beginning of June. We do harvest some onions earlier than that for what we call spring onions, but the bulbs themselves, when we're ready to harvest for storage, those are going to be that end of May, beginning of June opportunity. And so what we're going to do with those is we're going to pull them out of the ground, and then we're going to lay them directly on the bed if the weather cooperates. We'd like to lay them on the bed and let those tops wither and let the drying process begin right out there in the open. And there's two reasons we like doing that. One is it does leave a lot of dirt in the field, because as that dirt dries off, some of it's going to flake off, and we're not going to haul it back into the storage area with us. And also, it drastically reduces the weight and bulk of those greens. So if we don't do that, we have to haul all those wet greens around with us, and they're hard to dry out, they're heavy, and they're bulky. If we can let those onions lay in the sun for 4 to 5 days, then that's really ideal. And by the time we're done, it's a little like making hay. We've got some really nice dried out greens there that are no longer a risk of fungal or bacterial infection, really. One way or the other, we're going to move those onions into a bin, a well-ventilated bin. We used to do it in old milk crates. We've done it in bulb crates. Nowadays, we primarily use cardboard totes with a ring of hardware wire in the middle, a chimney in the middle, so that we have pretty good airflow. And we move them into our greenhouse, and we put a fan on them. We want to keep the air moving aggressively through them. And what we're trying to do in this time period of curing is we're moving the onion from a very green, wet state to a dried up. So what you see here with this dried shell around the onion, and then this is the real key right here. This was the onion neck, and of course when it was growing, it was a nice big juicy plant coming up right here. And we need all this to dry up, shrink up, and get to the point where it's no longer got any moisture at all in that neck. And the way we can do that is we just feel it. And of course initially when you feel that, it's going to feel slimy inside of there. It's going to be, obviously there's a lot of moisture there. And then as they dry, it'll go from being slimy to being kind of gummy. And then eventually you'll rub it and it'll be very clearly dry. And that's when we know we've arrived at a well-cured onion that's likely to hold a long time. When we get to that dry point, then we're going to move the onion into our coolers, which I should mention, we don't have to move it into the coolers. The coolers give us the longest possible shelf life. But if you've got just enough onions to sell for the next 3 or 4 weeks, there's no reason to put them in the cooler. You can keep them in the greenhouse and they'll be just fine. Once you move them to the cooler, it's kind of a one-way move. You don't want to move them to the cooler and then move them back out into a warm space for an extended period. It will shorten their life to move back and forth. It'll make them want to sprout, essentially. So make your choice there. Are we going to store these for long storage, in which case they're going into a cooler, preferably a dry cooler at 35 degrees or 32 degrees even. And then if they are not going to go into long-term storage, then you may want to put them out into a dry, warm-ish place. It doesn't have to be hot by any means, but something in the 60s or 70s is fine. Either way, good airflow is nice. Onions in storage do want to grow mold. They tend to grow a little bit of mold. So if you can keep airflow going through them, that helps a lot with that. And the other thing I'll mention is just stability. It's less important with the warmth. If you've got a little bit of variability in the warmth and dry, that's okay. But if you have variability in the humidity and the temperature in your cooler, then that really is hard on onions. They'll condense water in those layers, and then as that temperature rises and falls, it'll grow mold, and then you'll have moldy onions. So that's essentially the process from bed prep, planting, weeding, watering, harvesting, and into storage. Now, a couple things I want to point out. There's a lot of different points along there where you can sell those onions. So don't feel obligated to, we have to follow through the whole process. You can sell those onions as green onions as early as you want, as early as they are sizable to do that with. And we've done that many times, especially if you plan in advance for that. Maybe you plant them a little more densely and you thin them out. You can also sell them as what we call spring onions, which is anything for us from, like, say, a golf ball on up even to a softball, but it's when it's not cured or dried at all. It still has a green top attached. And that's a really popular farmer's market item. It's a popular CSA item. So don't shortchange the onion and say, oh, well, we're waiting for them to harvest. No, at any point in there, it's fine to harvest and put those out into the marketplace. And it's a great early spring cash flow tactic as well, to have enough onions that you can do that with. And then the other thing to mention about onions is that on the other end, if you have enough onions, they are a great crop to be able to store and carry into the fall and even into the winter. We have had crops of onions that have carried right on into March. We were still selling onions in March. That's unusual for us, but a lot of farmers pull that off. It's a matter of choosing the right varieties and having really good storage conditions and curing conditions. But that's a wonderful way to extend what's really a one-time harvest on out into the future quite a distance. And there's really never a time of the year when somebody won't buy a bulb onion. So if you have it available, you will probably be able to sell it at that point. That's onions on Millsap Farm. So let's talk about leeks on Millsap Farm. So we got our start in leeks basically by reading Eliot Coleman. And one of the things that Eliot Coleman diverges from a lot of old-time gardeners in is the way he plants his leeks. Let's take a step back and let's talk about how we establish leeks in the first place. So leeks are one of those plants that we're going to transplant out typically. People do sometimes direct seed them, but direct seeding any kind of allium is a little dicey because they start so slow and start so small. So on our farm, we definitely grow transplants. First thing we're going to do is we're going to seed transplants either into a deep tray or actually into a seedling bed. And we're going to seed them pretty close together. And then we're going to water them like crazy. They love water at this stage, and really leeks throughout their life. They're going to be water hogs. And they like fertility. So we make sure that they've got plenty of nitrogen in their soil mix as well. When we get done growing those, they should look like typically ballpoint pen refill size is the way I think of it. So, so it's not as big as a pencil. Pencil would be a very big baby leek, but we're really looking for something, the thickness of a flower stem or something like that. And we're going to take that, we're going to pull those out or uproot them, and then we're going to take them out in the field and we're going to dibble them into the ground. And this is where we diverge from some growers. So old school leek growing, a lot of people dug a trench, then they buried their leeks down at the bottom of the trench and then gradually filled that trench in. Eliot Coleman and others have learned, and we've seen as well on our farm, that it works just fine to use a really deep dibble bar. And so something like a piece of 1 3/8 pipe, we have lots of that sitting around because of all of our greenhouses, and I welded a cross piece on that. We step that in, and that hole can be as deep as, say, 8 or 10 inches even. It can be quite a deep hole. And we drop that baby leek all the way in there. We need just a little bit of green to be sticking out of the top, but that's it. It doesn't need to be any significant amount of plant out on the surface. And we don't fill back in. Those leeks are way down there, 8 inches below the surface. They've got a moist soil contact down there with their roots, and we're just going to leave that be. And the only thing we're going to do is water those in. So we'll put 3 rows of leeks on a bed, and we'll give them a fair bit of space because leeks do get big. So we're going to give them about 4 to 6 inches per plant, depending on how big the leeks we desire and which variety we're growing. Mostly we grow a lot of King Richard, which is a nice summer leek. And then in the wintertime, we prefer Bandit, or there's a couple other overwintered varieties that are nice as well. But what we're aiming for typically is we want our leeks to end up about the size of the ring of your finger and thumb. A pretty good sized shank is what we're aiming for. And so we're going to give them plenty of space to do that, because the tops, to support a shank that big, you're going to need a pretty big top. It's going to make a lot of foliage there. So we're going and we're dibbling on 3 rows on a 30-inch bed. We're putting those about 4 inches apart in row. They can be as much as 6 if we want really big leeks. And we're dropping those plants into the bottom of the hole, and we're not backfilling. And then as soon as we get to a good stopping point, we're watering those plants. And for the first couple days, you'll swear that you've killed all your baby leeks, because they wilt down and they look really sad. But if you are giving them enough water in the mornings, they'll still be perky. They should kind of look pretty decent. Then sometimes in the afternoon they'll fade a little bit. But within a week, you should have nice, healthy leeks that are now growing on very nicely in that deep hole that you've given them. And remember, we've given them a hole, I said a 1 3/8 inch pipe, so it's a pretty big hole. It's almost the size of the shank that we want, and that's not coincidental. The idea is we don't want to get anything in the way of those leeks as they start to size up. And so by giving them a hole that's big enough to make all that growth in, then we really have given them an advantage. We're going to stay after those leeks with water for as long as it takes. Sometimes in a dry summer, those leeks get water a couple times a week. It does help that their roots are down deep enough that they are tapping into some subsurface water, but never take it for granted that the leeks have enough water. We've done that a couple times and usually paid a price. Leeks will almost always reward you for irrigation. And we rarely have fungal problems with the leeks, much less than garlic or onions. And so the leeks, more than others, reward you for extra water. Typically our timing on planting leeks, we have 2 batches of leeks that we're going to plant. We have some spring leeks, and so those would go in the ground in March or April. And so those are currently on our seedling table. Here we are in the end of January. They're already growing on our seedling table. We'll be planting those in March into the beginning of April, and those will size up, and we should be able to harvest those by the end of June, beginning of July, somewhere in there we should have those. And that's nice because that gives people an opportunity to make leek potato soup. That's one of those pairings that comes out of the garden timing. And then we also have some fall grown leeks, and that timing is a little trickier because of the heat that you're trying to establish those plants in. But typically you would try and seed those around the 1st of June. You can even do them in mid-May, and then transplanting those out beginning of August or so. And the goal there is to carry those leeks into the fall, and they kind of limp along through the summer. They're not a fan of that August heat, but if you can get them to September, then September is beautiful leek growing weather, and they'll grow really strongly through September and October, November. And those types of leeks we're growing there, we're talking about Bandit, and there's a couple other varieties that are really designed and bred for winter growing, are extremely hardy. Some of the hardiest vegetables in the garden. So it's not at all uncommon for us to have some leeks left in the garden for one reason or another that make it all the way through winter without any trouble. But at some point we'll start harvesting those. Usually November, December, we'll start harvesting those winter leeks. And those are a lovely winter treat, and they sell really well as well. So try and do some leeks like that. And then again, other things to remember with leeks is they have 0 tolerance for weeds, and they have 0 tolerance for drying out. We rarely remember to do it, but if we could remember to do it, it would probably be a good idea to side dress your leeks a little bit as well. Even though those roots are way down under the surface, a little bit of fertilizer on top, it does make a difference. In the times when we've remembered to do it, it really helps them size up at that last month or so of growth. It gives them a nice boost. So if that's the spring leeks, then you're talking about doing that side dressing in say May, and if they're the fall leeks, then you would do that side dressing in probably the beginning of October or so. But that's leeks on the farm. They're a pretty simple crop. They do take a long time. It's one of the frustrating things about leeks. For what you end up with, it seems like you put a lot of time into them. And I guess part of the problem is it's the summertime when you have overwintered onions and overwintered garlic. That's certainly a long time period, but it was time you weren't necessarily using the field anyway. The leeks are sitting there in the middle of summer when you've got all these other things that want to take that space and use that solar energy, and they're just not doing a whole lot until you pull them out of the ground. But when you do, you're usually pretty happy with them, and they hold fairly well in the cooler. We harvest them with a digging fork. We trim the roots a little bit. We usually trim the tops as well, so when you pick them, they'll have these big, long, leathery leaves. We usually trim that to a fan and put it in storage. And depending on the leeks, some winter leeks will last for a month or so in storage. Summer leeks we find not much more than 2 weeks. They tend to want to yellow up on you. So not a great storage crop, but a really great fresh crop, and it's certainly an eye catcher at market and a favorite in the CSA. So that is leeks on Millsap Farm. All right, let's talk a little bit about garlic on Millsap Farm. So garlic, we always say, is one of our longest lived crops. It goes in the ground on Millsap Farm in October and November. Can even go in a little earlier. We don't want to put it in much later. And it goes until June, occasionally even the beginning of July, we'll have some garlic come out. So it's a very long-lived crop. And of course, a lot of that time it is dormant. but it's important to get it in the ground in the fall. Spring planted garlic really is not a thing in the Ozarks. It doesn't really work. You'll get puny small bulbs, and ask me because I've seen me do it. Not a good strategy. So fall plant, we've already talked a little bit about bed prep, but like all the alliums, it's really worth taking your time to make sure you're planting it somewhere that you have pretty good weed control. This is not a crop to put into a bed that has had heavy-duty grass or chickweed or any other, sort of persistent weed problem in the last several years. You want to make sure you've got good weed control before planting garlic. On our farm, we used to crowd our garlic a lot, and we've given it more space over the years and tend to get rewarded with bigger bulbs. So we will put 4 rows on a bed, on a 30-inch bed, and we'll give each of those bulbs about 6 inches in row spacing. And that's how we end up with nice big bulbs of garlic. It's worth mentioning that there's 2 main categories of garlic. There's hardneck and softneck. And the big difference on the planting end is just going to be how many pieces you get out of a head to plant. So if you're planting softneck, you'll need not as many heads to plant a bed as you would with hardneck. Hardneck tends to have fewer cloves that are usable for planting. But that said, they are otherwise culturally very similar. You're going to grow them in a very similar manner. So you plant these in the fall, and we plant them very shallow. You don't want them to be more than, maybe 1.5 inches below the surface at the most. And a lot of people mulch. We do not mulch anymore. We used to do mulch. This winter may make us regret our decisions. It was a really cold snap in January, and so if we have dead garlic, it's going to be because we didn't mulch. But we stopped doing mulch a few years back because in the years when we would have weed problems, the mulch would really complicate the weed problems. And so we don't do mulch on ours, but many people do. We do raised beds, and we're doing those 4 rows on top and about 6 inches in row spacing. So what you'll see with your garlic, if you plant it in October, it'll come up, it'll make about 6 inches of green, maybe a little more even. And then when it finally does get cold, most of that'll die off and it'll die back down to the ground. That's not usually something to be too alarmed about. That's pretty normal. Now there are times, like I mentioned this winter, when we had a really hard cold snap and a fairly sudden one, when that may change. You may have more damage than it typically would in those kind of conditions. But most years, it's very normal for the top to die back. And then in around February or so, mid-February, into February, those green tips will start re-emerging. And from there forward, typically you don't get set back. Typically the weather is warm enough by then that the garlic can tolerate it, and it's going to continue to grow despite quite a few freeze thaws. But as long as it doesn't drop below, say, 10 degrees or something, your garlic should stay up and be pretty healthy. So that it's growing great guns, and we want it to be from when it starts until it approaches maturity in June, July. We really want it to grow strong and fast and relatively uninterrupted. So the things we're going to do to make sure that continues, we're going to make sure it stays weed-free. This is really important. One of the complexities of growing garlic is that it's in the ground long enough that you're going to need to weed it several times to achieve a nice weed-free bed of garlic. Secondly, we're going to make sure it has plenty of water. Garlic sneaks up on you. It kind of sits out there in the field by itself, and you think, oh, it's fine, it's well established, you've looked at it, it looks healthy. But if you're missing opportunities to water it in the spring when, say, it gets a little bit dry, and which often happens, it gets windy and sunny in the spring, and the top several inches of soil can dry out very quickly, that's an opportunity to water your garlic, and the garlic will pay you for that. It'll extend dividends forward in the terms of bigger bulbs and healthier plants. So make sure it stays well watered. And then we're going to side dress the garlic. And we like side dressing our garlic in April. You could probably do it a little earlier, probably March would not hurt anything. And that's at like 5 to 10 pounds of, in our case, the chicken litter fertilizer on top of the bed. We don't try and work it in or anything. We're just sprinkling it on top. Ideally, we'll do it right after a weeding. And so we've kind of disturbed the soil a little bit, and that fertilizer can kind of work its way down to the soil that way. But again, I don't worry too much about working it in. Mostly it's a matter of getting it on the surface, and then a little watering will move that down into the soil profile pretty quickly. So that's the growing of the garlic, keeping it weed-free, making sure it has plenty of water, plenty of nutrients. And then we're going to start watching it with an eye toward harvest. And we should start watching really around the 1st of June or so is the time frame to be keeping an eye on it. Different varieties will mature very differently, and even in different years we'll get different maturity windows. The thing you don't want to do in the Ozarks, having done this a couple times and learned the hard way, you don't want to harvest late. So when in doubt, harvest a little earlier rather than late. And the reason I say that is, if you harvest too late, the wrapper leaves, and so if you look at garlic, it's got these nice white wrapper leaves that are dried up. These wrapper leaves will rot in a wet condition. And so if your garlic approaches maturity and you've got wet weather coming, then that might be a time to harvest your garlic a little early, because otherwise these outer layers will rot off, and then you don't have a nice head of garlic that's good for holding. You have a head of garlic that's kind of, it's really more of a collection of cloves, and that's not ideal. So we're looking for a window of opportunity when the garlic is close to maturity and we've got some nice warm sunny weather, hopefully, and that's when we're going to harvest our garlic. How do we know when it's ready? You know, other than like we talked about the weather thing, but well, there's a couple of things that we're going to look for. One is we should start seeing some yellowing of leaves toward the bottom of the plant. Now, different books will give you different criteria for that. I think that the common rule of thumb is 3 leaves. Yellowing from the bottom of the plant up is a good time to start thinking about harvesting your garlic. The other thing that is really, to me, more telling is if you dig ahead and the wrapper leaves are nice and tight. If the bulbs inside have filled out enough that now the wrapper leaves are tight, that's a good sign that it could be a good opportunity to harvest. It is true that the longer you let it go, the more bulk you're going to get, because the garlic bulks toward the end of its maturity. Before that, it's growing a lot of leaves and tops and roots, but that bulking time is a fairly narrow amount of time, and so the longer you can leave it in the ground, the more bulk you're going to get, but you're playing a game of sort of chicken with the weather, because if it gets too wet as that outer layer of garlic leaves wants to dry up, then they will rot. So anyway, that's what we're looking for. Like I said, in our climate, it's rarely before the end of May, but occasionally it has been. More often it's going to be mid-June, and then some varieties may wait and mature as late as July. Elephant garlic tends to be on the earlier end. Some of your artichoke and other small cloved but big-headed garlics are on the later end. But anyway, you should keep a close eye on the garlic patch in that time frame, because you're making the difference between a bountiful, beautiful, storable harvest and something that's really hard to figure out what to do with other than make garlic powder. So we're going to pull it. Oftentimes on our farm now, we have an undercutter that we use to harvest root crops, and so we'll usually run our undercutter through the garlic patch. We used to just dig it with forks. That ended up with a lot of skewered garlic, and also the roots were still very long. The nice thing about the undercutter, if we can set it just right, it goes through and it cuts the roots off about 2 to 3 inches long, and that's about right for curing. We want to leave those roots that long for curing. So we'll go through with the undercutter and pass that blade underneath the garlic, and then we can walk through and we can just pick the garlic up out of the soil, shake the soil off, and then you have a decision to make. Am I going to trim the tops in the field, or am I going to bring them in and dry the tops down? And we've done both. Certainly trimming tops in the field is a much more efficient method. And if you have really good curing and storing conditions, then that'll be fine. If there's any question about your storage and curing conditions, then leave the tops on and let those dry up in a hot, arid environment like a summer greenhouse. And that's going to give you your easiest route to good storage, is to leave the tops on. But in our case, most of the time we're trimming them like this. We're cutting them right at about 3 inches above the garlic head. We don't want to get too close, because the closer you get, the more likely we're going to have fungus or bacteria move down into the bulb. And so we want to trim it a little bit high. And then we're going to put it into black bulb crates and bring it into a controlled environment room. In our case, this is how we do it. We move it into a dark room that has a heater and a dehumidifier. Sometimes we don't even need the heater because it's already warm weather, and the dehumidifier will boost the temperature. But we're going to keep our humidity around 50% or less, and we're going to have a fan that moves that air all the time, so that we're constantly moving moisture off of the garlic and capturing that moisture in the dehumidifier, running it down the drain. For years we did this on the seedling table in the summertime or other places in the greenhouse, and that's fine and it works. But being able to put it in the black bulb crates means that all the processing is essentially done until we're ready to sell it. And so we can make it one touch. Take it out of the field into black bulb crates, put it in storage, and then leave it there until we're ready to use it. Now, your best lifespan on garlic is going to be that once you get it nicely dried down and the neck is dry and crispy, no longer gummy at all, Then you can take that garlic and put it into a 32-degree cooler, and that will give you your longest lived garlic typically. It also will trigger sprouting. So you have to be careful once you cool that garlic head down. If it rewarms and gets moisture, it will start sprouting, and there's really not a lot you can do to stop it at that point. So that's a hazard of cooling it off. If you leave it in the warm, say a 60 to 70 degree room, it tends to store longer without sprouting, but it will shrink down faster. You'll lose moisture faster, and it'll desiccate faster. So the ideal, again, is to move it from a dry, warm, curing environment into a cold, dry storage environment, very similar to the onions. But if you have any doubts about the ability to hold your cold storage environment at that cold temperature and keep it stable, then it might be better to leave it in that warm, dry environment. And it does also depend a little, like we said, on how long you want to hold it. So if you're just trying to hold it for a couple of months for sales, there's probably no reason to move it into the cooler. But if you are intending for it to be garlic that you want to use in February and March, then by all means move it into that cooler, and it will hold better in the long term that way. So that's the garlic. Now, of course, the other thing about garlic, and this is one of the few crops that we do this with on Millsap Farm. We hold our own garlic seed. So you're going to go through, ideally, a couple weeks after you've harvested, and you're going to sort out all the bulbs you want to use for next year's seed crop. And that's a good practice for several reasons, but primarily because seed garlic is really expensive, and so it's a great way to save money. There's not much risk of saving garlic as long as you're not seeing some sort of disease problem in your crop. And that's the common reason, for buying new seed on most things, is to avoid disease problems. But in this case, that's really not an issue. So garlic is a good one to save. And then for that, you want to put that, usually cold storage, doesn't have to be, it can be out in the warm. And then it'll be then used in October, November, right, to replant your new garlic patch for the next year. And so that is garlic on Millsap Farm. It's a great crop. I will mention one last thing. Similar to the onions, there is a whole spectrum of time in which you could sell your garlic crop. So don't be hesitant about pulling that green garlic when it's, the size of a golf ball. We have found that oftentimes chefs and folks at farmers markets will pay just as much for a fresh green head of garlic that's still maybe 2 or 3 or even a month away from maturity. And that's a much better dollar amount than try to cure it, dry it, hold it, and all that. So if you can sell it green, by all means do. And that harvest can start as early as end of April, beginning of May. So anyway, garlic on Millsap Farm is a great crop, and thank you for listening.
Thank you for joining Farmer Curtis Millsap and me for this look at alliums. For more information on alliums and the other crops covered by our series of videos, Practical Advice from Successful Farmers, visit the WebCityFarmersMarket.com website. This project is made possible with generous support from the Missouri Department of Agriculture Specialty Crop Block Grant Program, and it's a joint program of University of Missouri Extension, Lincoln University Cooperative Extension, and the Web City Farmers Market.